Hello, everybody. It's Dr. Watkins again, and this is Module 4 of our course, Foundations of Communication. And this particular chapter is on a subject that I have a lot of interest in. I think this whole subject of audience is interesting to me because I have been writing all my life and I have been speaking all of my life. Having worked for about 5 years as a public relations director, I quickly found out that it is important to plan a message and to target it for an audience and to plan it effectively. Whenever we think of audience, a lot of us do think immediately of a face-to-face audience, such as we see over on the right-hand side, where we have a speaker who is physically in front of a literal audience. That certainly qualifies. But an audience also can be a readership. In other words, people could be reading your paper. So whenever you're writing, of course, in college, a lot of us would quickly conclude that the primary audience for what we write would be the professor. So definitely we would want to keep that in mind because we need to demonstrate academic writing and, of course, the best quality of writing and communication possible. So in this course, we are thinking about audience in terms of both the written audience, in other words, the readership, and then, of course, the face-to-face audience as we are speaking. Our textbook includes a quote by a professor of political science. His name is Gary Jacobson, and he says, quote, "You don't have to convince people to support you for your reasons. You convince them to support you for their reasons." And if you think about this quote that's in our textbook on page 45, there's a lot of truth there. Whenever we are targeting an audience, it's very much like having arrows and a dartboard. We're aiming for the bullseye. And whenever we are writing or whenever we are speaking, whatever the situation may be, or the communicative situation, we need to think about who we're going for. I put these particular images up of these women just as an example because in advertising, for example, people tend to think in terms of who would buy a certain product. Well, advertisers strategically plan how they are going to reach these particular audiences. I know that when I worked as a public relations director, I was always very careful to think about who were we trying to reach. Are we trying to reach women between the ages of 20 and 40? Or is it that we're looking for another kind of what we would call demographic? So how are we going to reach the audience? A lot of your writing and our writing in college is what we call academics. So it's more formal, it's more professional, and of course that is a specific audience. But even as we are in the workplace or we move beyond the college, we have specific kinds of writing or specific speaking situations, and we will be talking more about that. But really, when it comes down to it, we have to think about if we're writing an essay or if we are preparing a speech. What are we trying to do? Two of the most common and dominant purposes would be the ones that you see bulleted there. One is to persuade, and I think a lot of us would agree that persuasion is a major aim for any kind of communication. Even when we look at the second bulleted item, to inform, a lot of us would recognize that even when we are informing others of particular information that we think they need to know, there is this implication that, this audience needs to do something. And so even underneath or subtly, that message can be embedded. In fact, a lot of people would argue that persuasion rules the world. Well, we could have a debate about that, but the bottom line is we are communicating. If you take a look at this billboard by McDonald's, I'm sure you're familiar with that restaurant, major chain, worldwide, international. Whenever we think about how big companies like McDonald's advertise, of course, seeing the information on a billboard is not the only impression we receive. We receive the impression from multiple sources, and this is well planned. I know that as I was involved as a public relations director and worked with overseeing an advertising plan and budget or marketing plan, we often went out and I strategically would request certain billboards if they were available to advertise our message. Whenever we are thinking about the audience, we do, as our textbook recommends and also reminds us, we need to think about what does the audience really know. And that's important because if we use terminology that the audience cannot understand, then we're not communicating effectively. Now, by the same token, we definitely want to use specialized vocabulary and concepts that the audience can learn and can know. But that means that we have to get them there. So, an old rule in teaching is that we start with what the people know and then take them to newer levels. I love the example that's in our book on page 48 under the subtitle that reads, "What does your audience already know?" It says, if your car mechanic tells you your car's EGR valve has gone bad and it's affecting the ABS and the TCS, some of you will know what that means. Now, let's just stop right there. That is particular to the field of what we would call automotive technology. If an automotive technician is explaining by using these kinds of terms, you will probably be at a loss for understanding what is going on. You know, it's very much like a medical doctor trying to explain a medical condition and you cannot understand. So we do have to keep in mind, whether it is writing or whether it is speaking, that the audience needs to be able to understand. And I think we do need to take the audience to deeper levels, but we must remember that we have to start with where they are. Speaking of audience members, we do need to think about the characteristics of the audience. Now, a lot of times you will have the luxury of being able to know right off the bat who's in your audience. Think about if you are standing in front of our classroom, you would know who's in the classroom pretty much. You would be able to see them face to face. They would give what we call nonverbal cues. You could see them express themselves facially, for example, whenever you were talking to them. Well, that's one scenario. But in a lot of other scenarios, you may never know who your audience is until you get physically to the location. Or in some cases, if you think about virtual communication, you may never know who all logs on to your message or watches your streaming video. So think about the age factor. If you take a look at this couple on the left, if you were talking about a subject such as Social Security, or if you had written about a subject such as Social Security, they probably would have an interest in the subject. There would be a vested interest. But if you try to talk or write about Social Security to the teenagers you see over on the right, you probably are not going to get much interest, if any interest at all, from that group. So age does matter. Now, can you get an audience interested in those subjects if they're not particularly interested? And I think the answer is yes. You have a lot of work to do, but you can get there. Our text also points out, whenever we're talking about audience characteristics, that gender and race really do matter. Now, we know in a lot of cases it doesn't have a major bearing, but there's a lot in communication studies about the whole issue of gender. Does a man take in information much the same way as a woman? I bet you we could get quite a debate started. And particularly when we talk about listening skills, some say a man does not listen like a woman, and vice versa. Well, just consider those issues. Also, think about if you are speaking with an audience on a subject such as, let's just say, controversial subject like abortion, and you have men and women in your audience, you would probably suspect that the men would react to your message in a way more differently than the women. And that's just a beginning point. Also, race, and when we're talking about race, we're not just necessarily talking about whether someone is black or someone is white. We're definitely talking about cultural heritages. The couple on the right hand side with their child represents a very large growing Latino population. And if you're in the United States, and we are, and you plan to continue to live in the United States, you need to become more and more aware of information pertaining to the Latino audience, because the Latino audience is the fastest growing demographic in the United States. And let's just face it, no matter where you stand, and perhaps you are Latino, we need to know more about different cultures if we are expecting to communicate broadly. And there's a lot to be said there. Also, the subject of religion is a very interesting one, and because I also teach religion, I find this particular subject to be of great interest to me. How much does someone's religious faith impact on his or her ability to take in your message, or how he or she would react to your message? I argue a lot. Now, how many different religions are there? Oh my goodness. Even if we go into, let's just say, Christianity and look at how many different religious denominations they are, it's mind boggling. But when we think about religion in general, some people will quickly tell you what his or her faith is or is not. But then, by the same token, beliefs can certainly have an impact on how an audience receives your message. Our text also talks about sexual orientation, and this is definitely an area of controversy. Now, no matter where we stand on the issue, sexual orientation is a consideration when it comes to audience characteristics. And if you are a communicator and you are planning to communicate your message effectively, certainly you need to have some sense of your audience. Now, in a lot of cases, this information would remain private. Socioeconomic characteristics, yes, it does matter. How much does your audience classify themselves as middle class, for example? Think about educational levels. All this is about your relationship to the audience. Yes, it could be a physical face-to-face relationship, and it certainly could be one where you never really know who is taking your message in, and that is certainly possible these days. Well, you know what? Speaking of these days, isn't it funny how we go right back into yesteryear? If we go back into antiquity, we think of Aristotle, and Aristotle is a giant when it comes to communication studies. One of Aristotle's so-called rhetorical appeals is ethos, or as some of us pronounce from the Greek, ethos. It has everything to do with credibility. So, bottom line, as you are communicating with your audience, whoever that audience may be, do they have reason to believe that they can trust you? And then think about it the other direction. Do you have a trust in your audience? You know, it can go two ways. The respect factor is one thing, but credibility goes a long, long way. If you have source material in your information, your references are rock solid, it helps to build your credibility. But if they're shoddy, well, you know the rest of the story. So now, as we continue to think about audience, remember that it's not just thinking about who is going to be reading your paper or who's sitting in front of you. It gets to be rather complex. Have a good one. See you later.